Welcome to Roleplay Geeks. Today we'll be talking alignment. In the GM's Corner, we'll give Steve another name and Jim skins a wiki. In Tabletop Chats, we learn what race and class Hasselhoff would be, we get interrupted by a ninja dog, and we cover the ever-contentious topic of alignment. So kick back, grab yourself a beer or whatever you like to drink, and settle in for the long haul. This is Hasselhoff at its best and the ninja dog at its worst. It's Roleplay Geeks, Episode 7. But first, a little bit of news. We have a new website up. You can head over to roleplaygeeks.com and you can check out all the information we have there, particularly our contact information, the latest podcast news we have, any sneak peeks for upcoming episodes, and all the places where you can listen to us, which are pretty far and wide, not to mention our social media outlets. Now for the Game Master's Corner, where we talk about alignment usage, the challenges of managing evil characters, and player motivations based upon, you guessed it, alignment. Okay, in this week's GM's Corner, we thought we'd talk a little bit about something that is a kind of a foundational concept for Dungeons & Dragons, but it doesn't show up in a lot of other games, which is alignment. And from a Game Master's perspective, well, if we're talking about Dungeons & Dragons, a Dungeon Master's perspective, alignment's kind of a tricky thing to wrestle with, I think, because it's something you have to keep track of for basically every player. And then you have to think about consequences and how that plays out. So, how about you guys? What do you do, if anything, with alignment as a game master?
Well, by the way, this is Steve-O, not to be confused with the philosophical Steve from the main group. This is DM Steve-O, GM Steve-O, or perhaps just let me be known this henceforward as the other Steve.
OS, gotcha.
The other Steve. OS. How about OS?
Or
Sounds
TOS.
good.
The other Steve. TOS.
Okay. I go for that.
TOS. The original series. It's a Star Trek thing. See, you get it?
Oh. See, I saw what you did there. Nice.
See what I did? All right.
Yeah. So, first of all, I would be interested, before I answer any of that, what does it mean to you? Like all the different lawful good, chaotic good. Like, in your minds, what are those characters like?
So for me, it's a kind of a strong dichotomy. So the way it's usually pictured is not exactly binary because there's two dimensions, but essentially there's set points in space. So you have the good, neutral, evil, and then there's lawful, neutral, chaotic, right? So you can only be one of 9 points. And really that doesn't make a lot of sense if you think about it. They should be continuums from one to the other, but really you kind of pick your point in space. And there's 9 points if you think of it like a grid. And that's where you're at. That's how I think about it. And that's how it's more or less depicted in the player's handbook, I think.
I don't think about it that much.
Well, for me, years ago, back during the satanic panic days, whenever guys like Pat Robertson was on television holding up the first edition Dungeon Master Guide, and my parents yelled at me from the other room and said, "Come here and see what he's talking about on the 700 Club." And I had to laugh, of course. Well, back in those days, one of the guys I used to game with, actually 2 of them, were interviewed for something. I don't even remember what. I think it was a radio interview way before podcasts. And they had that question, like, what's alignment? What's it all mean? So on and so forth. And I thought that he described it very well. He said, think about a village that's being threatened by a dragon. Lawful good would go in and slay the dragon because that's the right thing to do and would accept no reward. The chaotic good would go in and most likely, but reluctantly, slay the dragon and then maybe accept the reward afterwards. The lawful evil person, for instance, would offer to slay the dragon, but if the village didn't pay up, then he would be more than happy just to watch it get burnt to a crisp. And a chaotic evil person, who knows, would probably burn the whole village down, kill the dragon, take their money, and, kill everybody in sight, basically. Or team up with the dragon.
And call it a day.
Yeah, what do you think?
That sounds good to me. Sure.
Well, okay, so let's not get too much into what is an alignment, those little points, because functionally, particularly if you've been playing for a while, really players tend to act in general what the word I'm looking for, like overlapping Venn diagrams, if you will, kind of, I don't know, sort of spectrums. And I think you can broadly group them into good and bad, right? I mean, sort of, there's this good evil makes a lot of sense from a character spectrum sense. You're going to act usually good, or you're going to act kind of selfish, and evil is not really the right word, but kind of selfishly. But the thing is that you can, I think, allow for a lot of flexibility in that regard. Just like in real life, sometimes you're good, sometimes you're not.
I can see that, but and I know a lot of other people probably feel like me. So I'm really not a huge fan of the alignment system in Dungeons & Dragons anyway, because I think that's one thing that has made Game of Thrones or the novels by George R.R. Martin that they're based on very popular, is because unlike kind of old school Tolkien type fantasy, where there was very clear-cut rules of who was evil and who was not, who's the good guys and who's the bad guys, the orcs and the evil wizards, so on and so forth, and then all the good guys. And then in Game of Thrones, there's a lot of gray area. It's more like, you know, as we are in real life, everyone has their own agenda. Maybe whether you're good or bad, it's all point of view. You know, it's all relative, in other words.
I get what you're saying. I don't necessarily disagree, and I'm kind of playing devil's advocate here because I do go back and forth on this issue a bit. But at some level, don't you think that as an amount of escapism, getting away from real life in that regard is kind of what you're after? I mean, this notion that it's all gray area and sometimes you take a pen from work and all that other stuff like that. Yeah, that is life. There's no doubt about it, and it does make for interesting fiction. But at the same time, don't you want to be the hero of the story sometimes?
What are you talking about, man? I'm always the hero of my own story. Well, I always play chaotic good. I mean, I'm like the wrong guy to ask this about. I mean, that's my go-to alignment from time immemorial. I don't think I've ever rolled up a character. I'll take it back. I've played some paladins, so they have to be lawful good. I've never played an evil character. It's just not, just like video games. I never play an evil character. I just can't do it. I'm just not wired up that way. Sorry.
Sometimes it's fun. Sometimes it's fun to be the murder bot who skins Wookiees. I'm just saying, there's something cathartic about it.
Okay, so let's get back to the GM side of things. All right, which Jimmy brings up a good point. Is a GM, can you how adept do you think you are at dealing with evil characters or morally gray characters? Because me personally, I find it really challenging. I don't really understand how to motivate characters like that.
I find it very easy to do that. So the world is generally a pretty organized place, and it tries not to be very chaotic, particularly when you're in civilization. They don't take kindly to you going around slaughtering their citizens. So there's a balancing act the players have to manage. So if a character goes around and starts doing very evil things in populated areas, there's a mechanism there I can rein them in. Now, when they're out in the wilds, it doesn't matter as much because usually the evil they're doing is towards, monsters or other critters and stuff. So I don't worry about it so much. They can be as chaotic as they want out there. So yeah, I find it pretty easy.
But then how are you defining evil there? Because if those characters, I mean, to me, you're evil and you're out and find a stranded family and their cart, lost a wheel or something and they're stranded in the wilderness. An evil character is either going to rob them or kill them and rob them. That's evil, not going out and killing orcs and stuff like a good character does, because remember, those characters are evil.
I'd let it go. I might utilize it, though, later as a plot mechanism. Might be that they killed the wrong family because, their uncle's a bounty hunter, happens upon them, finds that they're dead, figures out that these guys killed him, and then he goes after them. There's consequences to those actions. Or not. I mean, maybe, just sucked that that family happened to be on the side of the road and met these evil dudes. It happens sometimes.
Well, what about you, Frank?
I said I struggle with this because really when I'm thinking about the motivating them, it's not responding to actions so much in isolation. I've made an adventure and it has a broad story, right? And I'm going to kick off the story, and the story is probably going to be some variation of, because you're intrinsically good people, you're going to go help this group, or you're going to go do this thing or do this positive into the universe, because that's just the type of people you are. I struggle a bit to keep characters on track if their motivation is always selfish and nothing more than selfish. So where they say, I'm going to go do that because I want to get rich and steal all the stuff. I can do it to some extent, but it's a struggle for me. I have trouble putting things into their path that is both challenging and interesting along a plot that doesn't service essentially a good story. And I think that's a limitation that I have as a GM.
No, you need to make them suffer, man. That's how I do it. So what you do, you put a curse in there, that makes them suffer, and somebody that they really start hating a lot because they make their life miserable, and then they have a goal. Their goal is to go after that dude and end him. Or the person who put a curse on him, or destroy some artifact that put a curse on him. I mean, there's a million things you could do there.
There's a million things you can do, but I mean, the thing is you've got to learn how to ad-lib that, and I don't know how to ad-lib. But I mean, if I want to run it on rails, yeah, sure, I could do that. But I mean, what happens if they go, I don't care? Well, then what do you do? I don't
let the
care
curse play its role. And, once they're wheeling around in a city on a board with some wheels on it because their legs fell off, it's a whole new adventure, baby.
Yeah, like I said, I just say that's probably just a limitation of me as a GM. I just don't think I'm very good at it, and I don't feel comfortable doing it.
So I know what you mean, Frank. I really like to, typically when I'm making up an adventure, working on it, I'm always assuming the characters are going to be trying to do the right thing. You somebody in distress or whatever. I mean, I've never really ran an evil game. I mean, I don't know. It's been so long since I ran a Dungeons and Dragons campaign. I don't really remember having evil characters. We had some pretty greedy characters that only would do things for money, or if they thought there was a lot of treasure. Those guys like treasure.
As a player in your games, though, you come down really hard on people who just, for no reason, kill things.
I'm a big karma guy.
You are.
Yeah. I mean, there's no sense in like killing innocent people for no reason. If you're that type of character, you're not going to live long in my universe. Sorry.
And I've adopted that way of thinking.
I mean, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, and I'm sure there's plenty of groups out there that love, and just like Frank said, it's escapism, right? They want to be an evil bunch of guys and, be mobsters in space or something like that and do all that. That's great. That's fun, man. If that's what you're doing out there in the world and you're having fun doing it, so what? Just when I'm running a game, I don't know, I'm just not wired that way. I have a hard time thinking about people doing evil things and them being the protagonists of my game or story or what have you.
To kind of tie this back and sort of put a bow on it a bit, so we started off talking about alignment, and really it's a D&D concept that hasn't permeated into other games very much. I can't think of any other game off the top of my head that has alignment, really. I'm sure there are others, but most of the games we play, like Traveler, there's no explicit alignment, but I think intrinsically there's a concept of alignment in pretty much every game that you run. There's a degree of, are you generally going to be a good hero in the game, or are you going to be an anti-hero, or are you going to be, an agent of chaos in the game? I guess in the Star Wars you get the light dark side, but that's the only other one. But it's a pretty common concept, but it's a challenging thing, I think, to do as a GM, to sort of walk that line. And like many things in the GMing side, you need to be in harmony with your players and your group. So if you have any thoughts about alignment, please always send us information. Contact information is coming on later in the podcast. In this week's Tabletop Chat, we discuss the origins of alignment, its role in game mechanics, and why we think a code is really a better way to address all the things alignment really is trying to address. Hello and welcome to Roleplay Geeks. I'm Frank.
And I'm Jim.
I'm the token hippie, John.
I am not a hippie, I'm Steve.
And we're going to talk a little bit today about alignment. Now, alignment is one of those interesting things that is a concept I think we've all been raised on at its root, but the concept of alignment with that term didn't ever enter into my consciousness, at least until Dungeons and Dragons. And it's the first time I ever sort of interacted with this notion that you are aligned a certain way. To really what we're talking about in game terms is morality, if you get down to it. So alignment, let's just sort of define it for in case everyone understands exactly what we mean by this, is that it essentially has two axes. So you have good, evil, you have lawful, you have chaotic. And this leads for a maximum of 9 alignments that you can possibly have. And you kind of find yourself in these zones: lawful good, neutral evil. And you have to sort of pick your zone. And when you pick your zone, it implies that your character has to behave in a certain fashion.
Steve is over there looking through a mold-filled player's manual from 1980.
I believe the technical term is moldy tome.
Yeah, I think that's 82 maybe or something like that when I brought that book. This is my original Player's Handbook, first edition, not first edition, but the second edition of the first edition of the game. But it is Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. I got it when I was like 82, I guess.
And it was on page 119 in Appendix 3 that the character alignment graph showed itself to us.
And was Frank correct in the number of possible combinations?
Yes. 9. Just 9.
Right. So let's just go through them real quick. We have variations. Well, this is actually a much more complicated question, I think. So we have lawful good, neutral good, chaotic good. So that's just sort of going along the good dynamic, which is not normally how they present this, but it's how I like to think about it. Then you've got so lawful neutral, true neutral, and neutral...
Chaotic neutral.
Chaotic neutral, sorry. And then you've got lawful evil, neutral evil, and chaotic evil. And from those 9 positions, I think maybe decades worth of argument as to what exactly constitutes each one has ensued. That's why giving examples it depends upon the person, I think. What would go into what example?
Now, in the original book, it was aligned at extremes like lawful good is saintly, chaotic evil is demonic. And there was an interesting thing that came up when I was in a Ravenloft campaign where we were talking about lawful evil and what it really meant in the context of D&D at that time. And lawful evil sounded really awesome to me, and I don't like evil characters. I don't like doing the things that you would normally expect an evil character to do, but the group I was playing in defined lawful evil as someone who adhered to a code that was their own or an established code for something else, but they adhered to it with the thought that what you wanted didn't matter. It's what I want in my code. And so suddenly I had a different appreciation for lawful evil than I ever did when we were growing up looking at this damn book.
If I remember correctly, druids had to be true neutral.
Yeah.
That's one thing I vastly remember all about. So
yeah.
They can be any other.
Yep.
And there was other alignment restrictions. So, so we sort of glazed through the examples of what it means, because I think it's a really hard question. But they definitely had implications for mechanics within the game. So, as John mentioned, if you were a druid, you had to be true neutral. If you were a ranger, I think you had to be some form of good, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
You could, whatever it be, chaotic or lawful or neutral or whatever it may be. But you had to be some form of good. There were, I want to say, rogues had to be something, or thieves had to be something at one point, and that may not be in the first edition rules. And then there was, if you're a paladin, you had to be lawful good. That was the only option available to you. And so it created, with the word alignment, I think it implies something with which you generally agree with. You generally align with those ideas. But the way it plays out in the mechanics, it feels a lot more to me like it's a fence that you're not allowed to move beyond for any reasonable purpose or means. And I've always found that very problematic and troubling.
I kind of agree with that. I never really cared for it. In fact, when we were first, playing, I never did anything with alignment. I never enforced anything. I never utilized any aspect of it. In fact, I completely ignored it in every respect of the game. Yep. I didn't worry about if a druid, I mean, I don't think we had anybody that played a druid when we first started playing. But, I mean, I remember that there was magic items that were kind of aligned, and only certain alignments could use them, and I would just, I just either went and put the item in, or I just said anybody can use it. I just never used it. I thought it was horrible. I just didn't like the idea of it, because the reality is that people change almost, at least that kind of barrier, in terms of like what Frank was saying, like that kind of fence just kind of fades in and out for people. They don't really realize that they might be overstepping. They think they might be an awesome person, but they, go to some place to eat, and they're rude to somebody else and cut somebody off in the parking lot, and they're rude to the server and don't tip anything, and they think, well, I'm a lawful good person. I mean, they would consider themselves to be wonderful and perfect in every way. But the thing is, people aren't perfect in every way. They're flawed, horrible, simple human beings. And so I never thought that the concept of alignment or trying to abide by it really ever fit. The only thing I ever thought that kind of worked would have been for like a paladin. You'd kind of need that. Or for a cleric. Because my attitude was, if you're going to play a cleric, I thought, you need to kind of abide by whatever your deity is. And you needed to, kind of constantly follow the precepts put down by that particular religion you're supposed to be a cleric of. And then along the line with, paladins. And that was the only characters I could see where it really made any difference at all.
Well, perhaps more broadly, this would fall under the general heading of like a character's background, or a character's upbringing or something like that, so that you've got a context to conceptualize how a character would or wouldn't behave within a situation. And in that context, I think alignment can make a lot of sense. If you sort of think, generally speaking, this character tries to do the right thing, or generally speaking, this character is mostly concerned about their own interests, or generally speaking, they try to follow the rules, or they don't care about the rules. That would allow you as a player to sort of think about the broad bounds for how you would react to a situation. So I think alignment has a lot of utility in that, but I really feel like within the popular culture of gaming, and even the way I've experienced it, it's either been we just don't pay attention to it because it's too annoying, or it becomes this shackle that bounds your character needlessly rather than forming your character. And I think that's a pretty, I'm going to use the word healthy way to think about alignment that we don't do a lot in gaming.
So something I had thought of, a few years ago when I was working on the research for my degree, was this difference between modernism and postmodernism, and the difference between the belief that there is this attainable objective truth versus a subjective truth, a truth that is written in stone and would be, just obvious to anyone if they thought about it, or your own interpretation. And I was wondering about alignment in that regard, because when this system was cooked up, you're still talking about people, and because of their ages and because of how they were brought up, that they were probably still entrenched in a modernist world with the thought that there is an objective truth, that you can specifically define something completely with a label that says to anyone else who looks at that label that they understand you, or they understand how you're supposed to act. Whereas I think nowadays, people are much more into the subjective side of truth. We see it in politics. We see it online and social media. We see it everywhere, where people believe that their truth is the defining truth and not some, overarching label that defines truth. And I wonder if for newer gamers, if alignment seems just a little too restrictive because it's applying a truth that is very rigid, and we don't quite live in that world anymore.
Well, to get a little less philosophical about it, I think that you're onto something in regard to the history of the development of the game. I think you're absolutely right. The people who did it and the world in which they were born and raised and existed is different than today's world. But they also constructed this game out of a set of very hard mathematical rules, and all the rules needed to fall into a mathematical certainty, a probability, so that we could assign a set of rules and regulations for anything you wanted to do, which is why there's so many supplemental materials and the books are so thick and all these other things like that, rather than some general guidelines. And I kind of think that in some ways the word character belies a little bit of that, because it implies to me a bit of thin dimensionality, that you're talking about an archetype, a trope is what you're playing, really. And therefore, it makes sense to conceptualize an archetype or a trope based upon these relatively overreaching and one-dimensional, technically two-dimensional, but one-dimensional alignments for morality. When the truth is, like John said, we live in a situated morality sense. So I've often said in the real world, I am a lawful good driver. I'm adamant about the rules and following the rules of the road, but I'm not a lawful good in other parts of my life. And so there's no reason a character couldn't also be as nuanced and in depth and sometimes contradictory in their movement throughout his imaginary space. And the alignment mechanism doesn't allow for that very well.
I guess it depends on how you play it, though, right? Because I think of it more of it's a broad general sort of statement about how your character acts overall. And then you can be more nuanced and just play the game. Maybe because in the early days, the game mechanics were so tightly coupled to things like a specific alignment. Out of necessity, you just sort of had to select it and play the game that way.
Well, I think there's something to be said for, I think you're right, when thinking on the early versions of the game and early instances of the game, and this is a whole other topic because we talk about rules lawyers, right? But you had a whole lot of people that were getting down into the minutia of what the text said. The text said this, so therefore that means this. That's how you interpret this. And rather than looking at the rules as a set of guiding principles, an overreaching way to conceptualize how to interact with the things in the world around you. Because I can remember in the few times I played with other people that alignment has been well, you can't do that because you have this alignment. And it doesn't make sense. Whereas that's up to the GM, I think, to set that tone, to say, well, yeah, you can play around with that general setting you have on your character. And that's okay. But that doesn't mean that overall you've changed or not changed or whatever it may be.
See, the thing I always thought would have been kind of neat would have been, like when I kind of later thought about, like, if we'd ever use it, would have been, letting a character do whatever as the DM, but then imposing penalties based. And another thing is, like, for a ranger to maybe do something, there's not a lot of, really penalties to him playing something neutral instead of good, is the way I kind of saw it. But for like a paladin or a cleric, then my attitude would have been there's definitive penalties that you can say, like, okay, well, your God doesn't give you any spells, when you pray for them tonight because you strayed from the path. You need to do some sort of penance because you took some money from that dish, even though you needed it, for whatever you guys were doing in your, travels. But you took money from someone, and that is against your code. That is against your alignment. That is against your deity. And so because of that, you have some penalties applied. So you can't get any spells until you do some sort of penance.
Another reason why clerics suck.
Exactly. But, like that. But the thing is that ends up being, like, I guess my attitude with it would have been like this. If we were to play it now, is kind of where I would actually probably do more with it. And I would probably enforce that sort of stuff. But at the same time, I think I'd actually want to make it more beneficial to be a paladin or a cleric because of said, having these restrictions imposed on you. So I'd want to make them even more powerful than they're listed. Because it's kind of one of these things of that, well, if just slightly straying can possibly completely nullify your character, or make it so you're, it's not fun to play or whatever, you need to make it so, there's a kind of a tit for tat kind of benefit to the restrictions on it, I think.
So you would enforce those kinds of ideas?
I would now.
But as a game master?
Yeah.
When's the last time you were a game master for Dungeons and Dragons? I mean, has it been since the president was able to play a saxophone? Has it been that long?
Ding dong. Ding dong.
Probably.
This would be the pot.
Calling the kettle.
Ding dong.
Well, I don't have any feelings about, how I'd enforce alignment, but
the thing is that we haven't had, the last couple of times we've played anything, no one has actually played a paladin or a cleric.
Because they suck.
Well, because they're not as... But again, they're not. But that's the thing, though, is this, as Steve was saying earlier, this dovetails into house rules.
Nobody can really pull off a halfling paladin the way you can, I bet. Or was it a gnome? Was it a gnome or a halfling?
It was not a gnome. A twisted
wow, that face.
Abomination? No. It was not a gnome. It's a halfling. Good God. And I think of halflings more like kinder than hobbits, just so you know. Not so much furry foot, but Hasselhoff. So,
did you say Hasselhoff?
Hasselhoff the halfling? If I could play... I am going to play a halfling named Hasselhoff now.
Oh my God.
That is my goal.
That is awesome.
Is he going to be a paladin or a cleric?
He's going to be a knight.
He should be a cleric.
Well, maybe I'll have to DM some D&D then. So, but I mean, I would probably, if I were to do something, I would actually probably add some things to paladin and cleric. But I would make a point of, you've got to walk the straight and narrow. Whatever your alignment is and whatever your deity is, and you'd actually have to, now I know the thing is for you, it actually probably wouldn't be too much of an issue, but for other people, I would probably just go ahead and do something and just say, you'd have to follow these things.
Little clippity cloppity clippity cloppity, and then click 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 click.
That was hilarious. I didn't realize he was in here for a second. I was like, "What's that noise?"
He'd be a great ninja if it weren't for the claws.
Yeah, in the water.
Yeah, he's
fantastic.
Thirsty. What is that? He's a little thirsty. Puppies get thirsty too.
Okay.
What were we talking about?
Sorry.
I'm still focused on Hasselhoff to have.
Yeah, Hasselhoff to have. No, but what I would probably do is I would probably want to add some house rules specifically for clerics and paladins. But you would have to follow that. But you'd actually have to then actually fill out some things for your deity in your alignment, and you'd have to follow them pretty damn closely. And I'd probably want to put in some stuff about how you might be hurt or at least diminished in your abilities if you strayed from your alignment or from your deity's practices.
I think as we're talking about this, the thought that keeps coming to mind is a word that you've used a few times, and you two have used, I believe, code rather than alignment. So when we're talking about things that a paladin should do or things that a cleric should do for their deity. I think that for me right now, that is more of a code of action than it is a definition of my particular character, because we probably all know someone who has X job and performs it, the way they should, but on the inside, they may not mirror what that job actually is. But you have to play the role of that particular job, that character, in order to succeed and get by. And if you go outside of the range of action for that particular profession, for that particular role, then you're penalized. But it doesn't necessarily have to be alignment based.
Well, so I'm a computer programmer, but internally I'm a beach bum. And so I do get yelled at if I lay out, on a towel on the floor at work and don't program my computer.
Tasty.
So that might be valid. So, but why
does everything smell like coconut oil in the office today?
Get out of here! You're in my sun. So yeah,
the skin is so smooth
and bronzed. Yeah, I don't know. Generally, I still don't really care. I mean, because we played D&D for I don't know how many years, pretty heavily. That's mostly what we played. But when we got into Traveler and some of the sci-fi ones,
a far better game, by the way.
Then that doesn't even come into it. It doesn't enter into the conversation at all.
Don't shake your head at me, Hasselhoff.
Well, I think it's an interesting point, is that I was struggling to think of other games that feature something like alignment in them. And I'm certain there are others. I'm certain people can name others. But Traveler doesn't. I don't remember that in Gamma World so much. I don't remember it in Star Frontiers. And these are all TSR games that sort of came out of the same, broadly speaking, development houses. I don't remember them in even things like Roll Master or Space Master. Now, those things could have been there, but and because of our views on alignment, we were just like, we're not doing that. Skip that.
That's that stupid
but
stuff.
I don't think it was really so much of a feature in those games, and I can't think of many others that I remember it even coming up. I know it's not part of Traveler. I don't think it's been part of Star Wars and those things that we played recently. So it is kind of almost a uniquely Dungeons and Dragons thing, despite the fact that the thing that it's supposed to be, sort of mimicking is very common for any character or any person. Again, like I said, morality or code or how you behave, ethical codes. And it's kind of weird that that's not in there. It does beg the question of why Dungeons and Dragons felt it was necessary and others don't feel it's necessary.
Well, to tell the truth, it might be kind of a little bit more on what Steve was saying. It might be a better case that still, if we were to actually play D&D again and have anybody that played a cleric or a paladin, that it makes a bit more sense to actually have some sort of alignment. And I guess to some extent a druid.
Were there spells that were restricted based on your alignment? So it was definitely, in the early days, a game mechanic, something that constrained the spells based on their alignment. For what reason, I'm not sure. I mean, I wasn't involved in the testing, but...
Well, you wouldn't want a cleric of a lawful good god to be going around necromancing things.
Exactly. That was only big when I really remember that it had anything in it. But I just did think about it. Star Wars, light and dark side. You couldn't use the electric storm on somebody. That was a dark side power, not a Jedi power.
What about the choking?
And choking was another one, yeah. I know there's at least those two, and I think there might have been a few others that you weren't supposed to use.
Yeah, I
as a
said that
Jedi.
thinking that, the Star Wars probably had the light side, dark side thing, but it was only for Jedi. If you played a bounty hunter or a
Right.
smuggler or whatever, that was not relevant.
Right. Well, I think that again, that actually probably would make more sense if we were to do something. Would be to, like what Steve said, more along the lines have a code of conduct. And as a DM, I would probably try and hold you to that with some, because otherwise it's kind of hard to sit there and say, in the middle of role playing, in the middle of a game, and you go, wait a minute, that's not very chaotic evil of you. Like, well, I'm expecting to get a reward when I see this little boy. Are you really? Yeah. I don't believe you.
Huh.
And I can just see that as a potential thing and then go, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense for you to help this kid, considering that he's the mayor's son and you hate everything to do with,
Well, I do think alignment does provide an interesting story hook, potentially, that if you're a relatively clever GM, and I'm not, you could use that to sort of leverage conflict, right? So I'm thinking of lawful anything. And what does lawful mean? And this is where you start getting into debates about what does this stuff mean. Does it mean you always follow the law? The name would suggest that, but how does that interact with your good, neutral, evil side of things? Because if you're lawful good and the law is telling you to kill a bunch of orphans, is that a lawful thing to follow the law, or is it a good thing to kill a bunch of orphans? It creates the potential for dramatic tension in resolving what is inherently an unresolvable conflict. Yeah, and I think this is where the reason that 90% of my characters that I've ever created ever are been neutral good, because I feel like neutral, I end up picking what I've identified, maybe incorrectly, but what I've identified as being the alignment that allows me the most latitude. I know as a whole I want to be good, so that doesn't bother me. But sometimes I want to follow the rules, and sometimes I don't want to follow the rules. So if I'm neutral, I have the latitude of sort of picking either side. And it's kind of a cop-out in a lot of ways, because it's really me saying I don't really want to bother to picking alignment, so I'm going to pick an alignment that allows me to kind of decide what alignment I want in any given moment. Arguably true neutral would give me the most latitude, but I think that's why I've done that as a way to get around the system. I rather like Steve's idea of a code. I'm intrigued by this because I think you could define a code very succinctly, but it could imply a lot. You could have a code that says leave no man behind. It's a very succinct, very on the surface looks like a extremely one-sided, one specific scenario that you would use this code. But I also think that it would imply a certain rules of behavior, loyalty and concern about others and that sort of thing. And it would well inform you, I think it could well inform you on how to behave in a host of other situations that wouldn't be a direct applicability of the code. So I think it's an interesting idea.
Yeah, definitely a better way to handle it.
There could be a lot more to that because, no man left behind.
Except for Doug. Nobody likes Doug.
Doug didn't do anything to you.
His last name's Hasselhoff.
I cannot believe you went there. Leave the Hoff alone. He didn't hurt you.
He ate that burger with his mouth open.
I'm going to go home and pay penance to his autograph for you. You know about the autograph picture I have.
Oh.
You have Hasselhoff autographed? What?
Yeah.
Seriously?
Yeah.
Like back from the Knight Rider days?
Actually, it was right when Baywatch was coming out.
So he's running in the picture.
No, but he is glistening.
Okay. So we've gotten a bit field from the...
We were Hasselhoffed.
But anyway, a code you're saying.
Yeah, and, looking at, other game systems and thinking about how they use virtues, they use traits, they use defining characteristics of a personality to put together so that you can, if you're building your character that way, you can build a character that's fleshed out and has certain motivations and fears and desires and wants and all of that without pigeonholing it into a particular alignment.
So there was one system I can think of that did have something kind of like alignment, and it's the system that has most disappointed me in my entire life because I really, really wish I liked it, and I really don't, is GURPS. GURPS had something like alignment, but I remember it had to do with the quirks and traits and all those type of, like you're talking about, virtues type of thing. It was in there back in the old original version. I don't know about the current version.
Wasn't it like the advantages, disadvantages kind of thing?
It's something like that. I mean, there were things in there that gave you alignment E type things in there. And it's just like way back in the first version. So, I mean, that may not at all exist today, but the GURPS is a system that I most forget because I wanted to love GURPS so much because it had those complicated nuances that I really liked. And it did allow you to get beyond things like alignment, but I couldn't wrap my head around how to play it well because of all those complicated nuances that challenged everything. So that is the one system I can think of that had something like that. So to wrap up our alignment thoughts, what's your last thoughts on alignment?
They suck. They're useless. I don't think I'd touch them with a 10-foot pole. But if we decided to play some D&D in the future and I GM'd, I'd actually probably encourage people to play because I'd probably get a bit more hard-ass and I'd probably add some house rules to make it more interesting, I think, to make it actually worthwhile to deal with the BS. I don't want some, payoff for the headache, as it were. FYI.
Steve, your final thoughts on alignment?
I hate alignment. It has caused me so much grief. There was an instance where I wrote to... How should I put this? So...
Succinctly.
Thank you. Succinctly, with no ums. Let's see if I can do this.
You wrote to?
I'm getting there. A DM took issue with the way that I was playing a character and said I was going against the alignment as he interpreted it. And I said, no, I was not, and I laid out my argument. I was so incensed by this argument with the DM that I wrote to the customer support for...
TSR?
Yeah. And the guy who wrote me back...
Oh, my God.
Yeah. Yeah, the guy who wrote me back, we ended up having this really awesome email chain back and forth. And he was like, man, I totally see where you're coming from. And I don't think alignment works in its spirit, the way that your DM is applying it. Unfortunately, as you know, he is the DM and he's decided to make that rule. And I said, I understand that. This just gives me a little bit of validation that I'm not a moron. And then I told that to a friend.
And he said, you wrote TSR?
That friend ended up forwarding it to the DM for whatever reason. I have no idea why he decided to do that. And then that caused a whole heap of gaming nerd
trauma.
BS.
It's like a soap opera nobody watches.
It was stupid. It was a very stupid thing.
As the RPG turns.
I can't believe you wrote TSR about that.
It was important. Because you guys, I was going to use different words, you guys helped raise me in a world where we didn't concentrate so much on alignments, pigeonholing the actions of our characters.
That's because we're not idiots. Alignment sucks. It's useless. Nobody should use it.
As I said, like my attitude would be in a good gaming session. The worst case maybe it'd be some sort of thing of some repercussions to your actions if I thought that they really strayed from the real alignment that you portray your character to be. Mm-hmm. But then that would be it and stuff. That's my attitude is you can't I wouldn't limit you saying you can't do that. I just go, oh, it's going to be bad for you. And your God would do whatever.
Hey, Frank.
Yeah.
What would Hasselhoff's alignment be?
Why would you pigeonhole the Hoff? I'm going to say pigeonhole like 8 more times before we end this podcast.
He'd be neutral good, I think.
Pigeonhole.
Neutral good? Maybe.
I think he'd be his own alignment.
See, he needs traits. He needs virtues. He needs disadvantages.
All right. So our time is running short, and
It's running long.
yeah. So let's go ahead and wrap this up. If you have any thoughts about alignment, please feel free to contact us. We'll talk to you in a couple weeks.
Bye.
Ta.
Say pigeonholed.
Pigeonhole.
And finally this week, we're going to look at alignment restrictions placed on things like spells and artifacts, most of that from previous versions of D&D. Should these restrictions be placed in your games? We're going to look at pros and cons and give you our final recommendations.
Hi, this is Jim.
And this is Steve.
Really? You're going to pause that long? Hey, you know who this is? This is Jim.
And this is Sluggish Steve.
And in this segment, we are going to talk about alignment and its role in spells and magic items. I think in 5e, they've pretty much left it up to the dungeon masters. The big question is, why did they do that? Where did alignment come from? And honestly, I've never really used it, so I'm going to lean on Steve a little bit here and see if he has any information to provide on this topic. What do you think, Steve?
All right. So if you think about Dungeons and Dragons being made by a boomer, and it was made, throughout the 70s, refined, put out, and we're talking about people who had a very, very, solid sense of right and wrong, good and evil, white hats versus black hats, Jedis versus the Sith. So, back then, we had good and evil. We had the Soviet Union against the United States. People still had World War II fresh on their minds. They had Nazi Germany against the Allied forces. It was very stark. And so I believe that our parents and grandparents came from a world where it was much easier for them to see things as black and white, good and evil. And so the alignment system gave you that. It gave you good and evil, and it gave you facets in between. So it's like a bell curve. Left side of the bell curve is good, right side of the bell curve is evil, and then you've got this massive lump of everything in between. But so much in the early days of Dungeons & Dragons was driven on alignment. There were spells you couldn't cast if you were not of the correct alignment. If you tried to cast one, it could change your alignment. If you were certain character classes, you had recommended alignments. And they've actually got a table in the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Player's Handbook that shows you that a ranger should be this, a druid should be this, a paladin should be this, clerics range between these 2 points. And so there was so much that was just alignment driven. You couldn't use certain magic items. If you changed alignment, you might lose class abilities and you had to work to get them back. But now we're on 5e, we're 5 generations later. And the world is a much, much different place. And it's not so much black and white anymore. People, I think the majority of people don't see things in quite a black and white way anymore. There is so much gray. And so in 5th edition, it seems they're kind of embracing that and leaving the choice to use alignment or not, and how much to use it and what to have it affect up to the game master and what kind of world that they're creating.
So do you think there's still a place for it in 5e? Alignment dictating restrictions on spells, on items, and on maybe relationships with deities if you're a paladin or a druid, cleric?
So I think there could be a place for it. I still think that it makes sense for druids to have a neutral alignment. I think that a paladin should be some form of lawful. A paladin needs to have this kind of structured order and a code by which they live by. And that's pretty well designated by having a lawful alignment. Lawful alignment should, in my opinion, never mean that you follow the law. It means you follow a code. If your code is to follow the law, then sure. But if your code is to do what is necessary for your success, that's still a code. That may make you lawful neutral or lawful evil. But, it still, I think, in some ways comes into play. They've erased so much having to do with alignment in the source material because they've even combined things. And Jimmy and I were talking about this because I had to go back and look at it because I didn't quite realize how much they had changed it. And so because of Jimmy, we just went back through and reread it. But protection from good or evil, protection from good or evil, there used to be 2 separate spells. Now it's one spell, and it covers other things. It's not like you're being protected against something with a good or evil alignment. You're being protected against these monsters that are aligned to good or evil. Celestials, angels, fiends, devils, aberrations, mind flayers, things like that. So they've kind of changed fundamentally what alignment used to be. And I think it matches real life more appropriately. But I do think that in a lot of adventures that alignment as a concept very much has a place. And that was a lot of me talking. Sorry.
That was good. So in some cases, I can't think of any spells off of the top of my head, but I mean, there are definitely some items that would be considered like truly evil or truly good.
Well, if you were, searching for the hand of Vecna.
There you go.
So, I mean, that's about
as evil as you get.
Yeah. I don't see the priest at your local, church, say Mr., the guy's in charge of the Presbyterian church strolling in one day with a mummified hand around his neck, and you're going to be like, hey, Father Ted, thank you for coming in today. What a nice desiccated hand you have.
Right. Yeah. So there are those truly evil items, and, Game Masters populate their worlds with those kinds of things all the time. So I think there's a place for it, but now it's in the hands of the Dungeon Masters to what degree they're going to put them in their adventures.
Yeah, the one thing that we did come across that seemed to have a fairly important role with alignment is with sentient items. Now, sentient items used to just be, for me, the most awesome thing I could imagine having when I was playing D&D in the beginning. And, you used to have these personality roles, and you basically had a contest with the item to make sure that it did not possess you, and you became its thrall. And then you had to have an alignment that was compatible with it, because these sentient items, they're not human. They're essentially a constructed artificial intelligence. And so they have motivations and they have desires which are completely out of the realm of human experience. So their drives, are not modified by the same things that ours are. And their, kind of goal, means that they don't acquiesce. I mean, they want what they want. So having an item that fights someone based on even their alignment, whether it's compatible, if you even have a chance of wielding something or being able to use it. And that compatibility has to come from somewhere, whether the DM wants to use alignment or try and make it something else. To me, alignment in that particular case makes sense to use as a parameter, for getting these things to work or not.
So I guess it's up to the Dungeon Masters to decide how much alignment's going to impact spells and items, and I'm okay with that. And that's pretty much all I have to say about that. Any last thoughts, Steve?
Don't you think I've said enough?
Well, I think that's it for this episode of whatever this is. We'll catch you next time. Bye.
Thanks for tuning in to Roleplay Geeks. You can now subscribe to our show via Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts, just to name a few. You can follow us on a lot of social media. For example, Instagram can be found at Roleplay Geeks, Twitter at Geeks Roleplay, and Facebook at Roleplay Geeks. Head over to roleplaygeeks.com for all our social media links and our contact information. And as always, thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you next week.